Okay, in this section, we're going to do some comparisons internationally. So one thing to tell you before we start is I'll give you a big caution. Um, the unemployment rate can be measured very differently in different countries. Between most of the wealthy countries in Europe, in the US, Canada, Japan, it's mostly fairly similar how they develop it. I mean, how they measure it. But if you're comparing across a big swath of different countries around the world, the quality and the way of collecting the data is totally different. So, for example, China measures their unemployment rate totally differently than the US does, and so they're not really comparable in any way. So when you're comparing for cross countries about any kind of data, you need to be careful about the measurement issues. But unemployment rate is one that's notoriously different across countries, so we need to be really careful in comparing. That said, across the country, we're going to look at here, the way of measuring is fairly similar. They do a monthly survey, they find out a household survey, and then they use this to estimate the number of unemployed, the number of employed, and the number of people who are out of the labor force. Okay, so for here, this caution, you can kind of disregard it for now, but in general, this is something to keep in mind. Okay, so first of all, we're looking at some countries here. So we have Italy, France, Canada, US, UK, and Japan. I want to highlight a few things. Okay, so first thing I want to highlight, let me see, I'm going to use a green highlighter. I'll highlight the US just so you can see where it's at. Is the US. And so first of all, when you're just looking at these, you can see the big jump for the financial crisis. You can also see that it tracks the UK pretty well, except for I guess before 2000, the UK was quite a bit higher, but it kind of tracks the UK pretty well. So the main thing you can see, well, this is on the low side, right? The US one is on the low side compared to the other countries. So let's highlight France, this purplish color. So let's highlight France. I mean, you can see it, but it makes it easier to the eye to see if we, so, well, you can see here as well, France is consistently higher, except for one little spot. It's consistently higher than the US, right? And so the question is sort of, well, why is that? And then you can see if I highlighted Italy, it would also be consistently higher. Many of the countries, not all, but many of the countries in Western Europe would be consistently higher. And then finally, just to do one more, if I was to highlight Japan, then we find it will be consistently lower. Now, some of you may have heard, well, the Japanese economy is not doing that well. Why is this unemployment rate so different? And so one of the differences is Japan actually might have some unique things. So they find that Japanese companies are fairly reluctant to lay people off, and so they often will keep workers who are not really doing very much during poor economic times. They also, it seems that the Japanese workers also will spend less time in the job search mode than in some other countries. So for some reasons, Japan is much lower than the other countries. Okay, so here I just want to kind of highlight there are international differences that are kind of consistent over time, right? These are kind of like long run differences. And so I want to highlight some of the reasons. So let's just compare here mainly between the US and France. And we're kind of using France as a representative case of a Western European nation. So there's some key policy differences that tend to create higher unemployment rates over time, higher measured unemployment rates over time. And so some of them are on the side of the firm, and some of them are on the side of the workers. So let's kind of just summarize these real quick. So one of the things that can be different, it can be hard. The policies can make it hard to let workers go. So some of you would say, well, that should create a low unemployment rate because the companies can't get rid of their workers, so they can't lay them off. So then the unemployment rate should be low because they're not laying off workers. Well, the only problem is for the re-entrants and the new entrants. So yes, that would be true. If you already have a job, you're less likely to lose your job, right? But if you're a young person coming out of school trying to find a job, it'll make it much harder to get a job. And part of the reason is if firms, if it's really hard to let you go, then it's risky to hire you because if you don't work out, they're going to be stuck with you. So many of the countries in Europe that have these very strict policies about letting workers go, they tend to, for young workers, it tends to be really hard to get their first job. And also, it tends to be there's lots of things where they get a job on sort of a trial basis, but to get a long-term permanent position is very difficult. Part of the reason is the firms are scared of getting those people because then they might not be able to let them go in the future, or it might be very expensive to let them go. Policy can also make it expensive to hire. Okay, so how would it be expensive to hire? Well, if minimum wage was extremely high, so if minimum wage is above the equilibrium rate, quite a bit above the equilibrium rate, this would make it more expensive to hire. Also, if there's mandated lots of paid vacations or lots of benefits paid by the employer, it gets more expensive to hire, and then the employers are going to want to hire less people. So there's some more things we could say, but let's just call it this good for now. So these are on the side of the firms, right? So the firms will want to be hiring less people, and so we might end up with more like long run, we might end up with a higher unemployment rate. And then the third one is something about the incentives of the workers. So the length of and the amount too, but especially the length of the unemployment can make a big difference, right? So this is the workers' incentive, or the job searchers' incentives. So if we also find that if unemployment benefits are really generous, and especially if they go for really long periods of time, that it takes some of the incentive of the worker to go out and find a job is sort of diminished to some extent. And so we find often in countries that have more generous unemployment benefits, people will stay unemployed for longer periods of time. So we see definite consistent patterns. In the next section of the course, we're going to come back and talk about this. So we're going to talk about the different types of unemployment, and these will be mostly related to the frictional and the structural unemployment. So we'll come back and talk a little bit more about this later.